Welcome to this time of review as we seek to solidify our reading and place it back into the meta-narrative of the story of the Bible. Well, so what we see is we've read this past week 5 different letters, 4 written by Paul and 1 written by James. So he wrote a letter to Philemon, and I love the book of the little letter to Philemon. It's called, I believe it's Warren Wiersbe calls it a little postcard. And what you see is Paul is saying it's time to restore this runaway who was won to Christ while Paul was incarcerated. You know, so what do you see? That you can have fruit in the most unusual and likely of places. When you understand that God in the providence, He's allowed you to be there, and you're on the lookout for someone to share with. In fact, I was reminded of this today when I was at the post office. And I was standing there in the line, and you know how you just, like, you overhear the conversation of everybody around you. So there's the 2 people right there in front of me. They're having this conversation about their prayer life and intercession. And one was this policeman who has this incredible ministry with street kids, and I'm just listening to that, and I'm like, I guess I just have to intrude in on that. And so I introduced myself, and I'm like, that is really cool what you're doing. Why? Because looking for opportunities, looking for people who need the gospel message. And so you see, what is he doing? He's writing this letter to encourage his friend and his co-worker, one he had probably led to Christ as well, to restore Philemon, and that he would be useful for him for the sake of the gospel. Then you see his letter to the Philippians, and I love this little letter too because it's all about joy. It's about rejoicing. And again, what is the context? Paul is incarcerated, but it's like rejoice. Rejoicing is an act of the will. It's a choice that you make based on information of your understanding of who God is. And when you appropriate all that God has revealed about Himself in your bad situation, the only response you really can have is a time of rejoicing. So rejoice in what? Count what things that were formerly considered gain as lost to Christ. To understand that the things that you thought were important before, that there's nothing that compares to the glories that we have in our relationship with Christ. You see in the book of Philippians, he talks about the Christ humbled himself and he embraced death. So therefore, what could Paul do? He could also humble himself and embrace the incarceration that he faces and experiences. Not only that, you see in the book of the Philippians, you see that rejoicing is the atmosphere of Christ's followers regardless of their circumstances. So what does this tell us about a born-again believer for us today? That there's no cause for us to grumble or complain. We have every reason to rejoice all day long. Then you come to the letter written by James, the half-brother of Christ. And so what you see is, what I love about, he talks about this throughout his letter. He says, my brethren, because he's writing to the 12 tribes of Israel who've been dispersed, and he's addressing them as his brethren. But his audience is also Jewish background believers. And so what is he doing? He's saying, all right, now all of us live life outside of the Garden of Eden. How do you appropriate the faith that you say that you have? It's going to show up in how you live. So he talks about holding on to the faith. And this faith is never passive. It shows up during trials. Temptations shows up by how we discipline ourselves. We say no to the flesh. It shows up in how we treat other people and in our personal conduct. And James lays that out very clearly and challenges us that we don't just have a faith that's passive based on some beliefs, but it's going to show up in every area of our life. Then you come to the letter of Timothy. And I love this because Paul is writing, there he's in prison, he's thinking, and he loves these guys he's invested in. And he's like, what can I do? What can I say that's critical for them to know and understand? And so therefore he addresses young Timothy, and Timothy's like, man, it's intimidating being in the ministry. I'm a young guy. And so he addresses that, and he tells him to flee from any appearance of evil and preach the word with boldness and courage. And so what is he doing? He's addressing a person who's intimidated by the calling that God has upon his life, the probably inadequacies that he feels, and so on. And that Paul is encouraging him from one generation to the next, which gives me a real challenge to say, how encouraging am I to those who follow me and pouring into their lives as well? Then you come to the letter of Titus, and here you have Titus has left him. He remains there at the church in Crete, and Paul addresses this letter to him and just says, strengthen or straighten out what remains there. Straighten out, bring to order with situations with the elders, some administrative roles that they have, and what does that look like? Bring to order women. What does that look like? Because if there's disorder, there's going to be chaos. And so Paul is definitely and deeply interested in the spiritual welfare and the structure of the church and people learning how to navigate one another and the roles that God's given them in that church. So you see, encourages them to walk out discernment, and that they would have sane minds, that there would be something total that would breathe the air of sanity about these believers. And so what you see as you read these letters, think about if you're the recipient of that letter too, because you bear as a stewardship the responsibility to be an ambassador to a lost world. Not only that, a responsibility to be an ambassador to the lost world, but you have responsibilities to believers around you, and you have responsibilities for the believers in the next generation who are going to take your place in leadership. So invest well. We only have this life.